failing to plan or planning to fail. We look at the lessons from the First Battle of Bullecourt.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War podcast. This is episode 74. This is the second part of our series looking at the lessons, particularly for the employment of artillery, from the First Battle of Bullecourt. This is part of our series commemorating 150 years of permanent Australian artillery. And as such, we're pulling out the key lessons for the employment of artillery from decisive battles that the Australian Army has been involved in. Now, if you've listened to the first episode, you'll get an indication of just how bad things are going in the planning for the Battle of Bullecourt. I've chosen the Battle of Bullecourt to look at because it really does give you an example of just how badly things can go if insufficient planning and resources is allocated to the provision of offensive support. On the 5th of April, the orders are issued for 1st Anzac and British 5th Corps to attack on a front of 3,500 metres with the town of Bullecourt in the centre. In the Australian sector, the Germans had laid two 30-metre wide belts of barbed wire. There had been very little progress in the reducing of these obstacles. The CRA for the 4th Division, so the Commander Royal Artillery, was Rosenthal, and he would have three field artillery groups. N Group, which was the 1st Divisional Artillery, P Group, made up of the 4th Divisional Artillery, and Q Group, which was the 2nd Divisional Artillery, plus the 12th Army Brigade and two batteries from the 6th Army Brigade under Lieutenant Colonel Rabbit. This is Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Lee Rex Rabbit. He plays a significant role in this battle. After the war, he continues his militia service. He becomes the commander of the 2nd Divisional Artillery and then commands the 9th Infantry Brigade. He was also a strong proponent of the Festival of St. Barbara, which is celebrated on the 4th of December, St. Barbara being the patron saint of gunners. It had been assessed that there was about 8 days' worth of work that needed to be done prior to the assault commencing. And on the 31st of March, the 4th Divisional Artillery was conducting a relief in place from the 2nd Divisional Artillery. But that became confused. It was then postponed 48 hours and then cancelled. It was becoming increasingly likely that not all of the 7 field artillery brigades would be in position by the 8th of April, let alone conducting the 8 days' worth of bombardment that was required to set the conditions for the assault. Rosenthal was struggling to get the guns into position, but it's not just about getting the guns into position. They also need the ammunition stores required, and there was significant shortages of ammunition. Remembering that this is a supporting activity to a diversionary attack in support of the Nivelle offensive, so ammunition was very hard to come by. In A Greater Sum of Sorrow, David Coombs describes some of the issues with the artillery preparation. On the 2nd of April, 1st Anzac Corps Heavy Artillery fired 1,100 rounds of ammunition. The following day, it fired another 1,695 rounds, barely sufficient to do any real damage to enemy positions, let alone make serious inroads into cutting the wire. However, by the 5th of April, Australian and British heavy artillery were able to considerably increase their rate of fire. Over the next 3 days, 12,346 shells, mostly from 6-inch, 8-inch and 9.2-inch howitzers, were fired by 26 batteries belonging to 5th Corps and 1st Anzac Corps, although only a small number of high-explosive shells were armed with instantaneous fuses designed to cut the wire. Another 2 counter-battery groups fired a further 11,235 shells. Gough had originally wanted to attack on the 9th of April. This would have coincided with Allenby's assault. However, he delayed for 24 hours, so the attack would commence on the 10th of April. Reconnaissance on the 8th of April by air patrol showed that there was only partial damage to the wire, and White told Gough if the attack went ahead, the troops were likely to be cut to pieces. On the 9th of April, patrols confirmed that much of the wire was still uncut across the whole front, and in some places it was 30 metres thick. We are now less than 24 hours from H hour for this assault going in. There are significant issues with the amount of gun ammunition. Not all of the guns are in place. The barbed wire is intact, and there's been no plan for the neutralisation of the machine guns. Delaying the assault at this late stage would have created issues for Gough with his superior Haig. He probably was quite reluctant to be highlighting this problem so late in the planning process. However, it appears that salvation was at hand. That salvation came in the form of Major William Watson, the officer commanding No. 11 Company, Delta Battalion, Heavy Branch, Machine Gun Corps. He presented a plan for a surprise attack using the tanks to crush the wire, enabling the infantry to get through, attacking en masse, all 12 of them, and they would then suppress any of the strong points or machine guns that were attacking the infantry. Gough was highly impressed by the idea and ordered a detailed plan to be created for an assault that would take place less than 24 hours later. What could possibly go wrong? A still extremely new weapon system was going to be used in an assault on one of the most fortified parts of the Western Front, with troops who had never cooperated with tanks before. The scheme of manoeuvre was for the tanks to advance over a 1,500 metre front, up the rear entrant in the Hendecourt-Rancourt area. The line of departure was 600 metres short of the wire, and H-hour was set for 0430. There would be no initial artillery bombardment. The artillery would conduct flanking fire only in support of the advance. Birdwood made multiple attempts to convince Gough of the difficulties in fundamentally changing a plan with less than 24 hours before H-hour. However, none of this was successful. Gough was convinced that the attack should go ahead as planned. Even Major Watson, the commander of the tank plan, was somewhat startled by Gough's recklessness and intransigence. The scheme of manoeuvre for the infantry brigades was rapidly changing, with differing objectives, differing timings, and differing ways that the assault was going to be carried out. The old adage of order, counter-order, disorder was starting to become apparent within divisional and brigade headquarters. Gough, however, was incredibly optimistic. He still had as a main priority the breakthrough with the 4th Cavalry Division, which was to exploit the breach that would be created by the two divisions. Coombs, in his book The Battles of Bullecourt, describes the situation on the day prior to the attack. As late as 10 a.m. on the 9th of April, Durand, the CO of the 13th Battalion, received Brigade Order No. 74, advising him that the attack was to proceed with artillery. A little over 12 hours later, at 22:20, he received another message from Divisional Headquarters reaffirming attack with artillery support. It wasn't until 23:59 that he was told with some certainty that the attack, still scheduled to commence in 4.5 hours, was to proceed with tanks as support, but with minimal flanking artillery barrage. Not long after midnight, on the 10th of April, so the day of the assault, Holmes, this is Major General Holmes, the General Officer commanding 4th Division, dispatched last-minute revised orders to his brigade commanders. 1. All troops will form up in rear of the jumping-off trenches already marked out, under cover of the railway embankment and cutting. 2. At 0430, the artillery will put down a flank barrage on Quillon and Bullecourt, and the tanks will move forward. 3. On reaching the trenches, and as soon as they have occupied them, the tanks will display a green disc, meaning come on, or make some other prearranged signal. 4. The infantry will then advance and occupy the trenches. 5. The artillery flank barrage will be kept on until ordered to stop. 6. The heavy artillery are shelling Bullecourt, Rancourt and the Quillon salient trenches until 0430. 7. As soon as the trenches have been made good, the 4th Australian Infantry Brigade will move forward. This subsequent operation will be supported by tanks, which will go to Rayancourt and Bullecourt. Holmes added, paragraph 1, stow the men away somehow. Perhaps Holmes concluded with, there is no certainty that the attack will take place. All depends on Third Army. The tanks will crumble down the wire. It would appear at first glance that potentially Gough had somehow transgressed the 1/3, 2/3 rule, in that you would allow 1/3 for creating orders and 2/3 of the time for allowing your subordinates to promulgate it out to their subordinates. Shortly before H hour, Brigadier General Brand, the commander of the 4th Brigade, was addressing his COs with the updated orders. Captain David Dunworth, who was there, later wrote, he found Brigadier General Brand apparently despondent. Then and only then we learned that the orders had been altered. The barrage had been dispensed with and tanks substituted. This news came as a thunderclap. Every officer and man knew his job by heart. Now we had to cancel all their instructions and rush out fresh ones. No chances to get the men together, and best we could hope for was to get the officers and NCOs to know the new plan as well as we could. The 4th had every confidence in its ability to follow a barrage. It had been said that the 4th Brigade, they lean up against the barrage, and when it lifts, they just fall on top of the enemy. But tanks, we know nothing of. We had never seen one in action. At my suggestion, Lieutenant Colonel McSharry, the CO of 15th Battalion, asked couldn't we have the barrage as well, but was met with the answer that the tanks could never cooperate with artillery. Dunsworth recollected that, with vile humours, we rejoined our unit and got into positions deployed along the railway line about 1,600 yards east of Neril, where we endeavoured to explain the new instructions. The issue of those orders was greeted with disbelief by most junior officers and non-commissioned officers. At 0100 hours, a bombardment of phosgene gas was commenced using the 4-inch Stokes mortars and Livens projectors. By 0330, 6,000 Australian troops were in position awaiting to advance. At 0430, the artillery opened up the flanking barrages exactly on time. There was only one problem. There was no sign of the tanks. The British official history states that the explanation of the delay was telephoned to Major Watson at divisional headquarters. The tanks were still 2 miles short of Neril. They had been caught in a blizzard and on the downs, and though never actually lost, they had to feel their way yard by yard. It would take them another hour and a half to reach their starting point. Major General Holmes took it without referring to higher authority. We must postpone the show. I think there is just time to get the boys back. The commander of 4th Brigade, Brigadier General Brand, issued the following order. The stunt is off. Dispositions as yesterday. Move. Whilst the cancellation of the attack got to the Australian battalions on time, it tragically didn't make it to the battalions of the 62nd, 2nd West Riding Division, and they commenced their attack, which was in support of the Australian attack, not knowing that it had been cancelled. By the time their patrols had returned from no man's land, they'd suffered 162 casualties. All thoughts of surprise were now lost, and the Germans reinforced the Bullecourt area heavily. Troops that were meant to be dispatched to the Arras area were held back, and the number of machine guns in the area was significantly increased. 24 hours later, the Australians were to find that trenches that had been lightly defended were now significantly better prepared for the defence. Over the next 24 hours, the plan for the attack continued to change. Brand, the commander of the 4th Brigade, continued to fight for increased artillery, knowing that he was unlikely to get the support that he required from such a small number of tanks. One interesting thing that Brand wrote after the battle was that he needed to take the same risks as men. It was the taking of those risks which gave the leader experience and secured the confidence that won battles. They who never saw no man's land lived in another world. They were in the AIF, but knew not its soul. Nothing bucked up frontline units so much as to see their brigade and battalion commanders moving around the foremost trenches at least once every 24 hours, gaining first-hand knowledge of the position, appreciating their difficulties, sinking ankle-deep into the mud and slush, sheltering temporarily in a shell hole till a strafe was over. That was not empty bravado. A word of encouragement to nerve-racked diggers was worth pages of eulogy afterwards. The next morning, the troops assembled. Captain Tom Chataway of the 15th Battalion wrote, "Before the men left, man after man shook hands with me and bid me goodbye. They knew their hour had struck. I felt very bad. The element of surprise was lost. The tanks could never make up for it. 800 yards of open country to be traversed and not a gun to be fired as cover for the advance, nor the destruction of the barbed wire entanglements before the enemy position. The tanks were to do all this." At least that morning, some of the tanks started to arrive, with the first one getting to its line of departure at 0300. By HR 0430, all of the tanks were in position. Captain Nicholson, commanding the 114th Battery from the 5th Divisional Artillery, wrote, "Out at 4 a.m. and stood by the guns. We fired in the flank barrage, fired 1,200 shells, including 430 smoke, fired into the Hindenburg line from Quillan towards Bullecourt and kept putting in smoke to obscure the Germans' view of that flank attack. The advance commenced with the tanks in the lead. However, they were very slow and the infantry soon overtook them. The Germans commenced their defensive fires. One of the diggers, George Mitchell, wrote of it, "A tornado of thunder and flame. The blast of one shell would send me reeling forward, while another would halt me with a wave of driven air. A headless man fell at my feet as I rolled him over a sheet of flame fanned over with a blinding light. A score of men just in front of me melted in bloody fragments as a big caliber shell landed. The air was dense with crackling bullets and thick with the blood-chilling stink of explosives. The plain was carpeted with bodies, mostly lying still, but some crawling laggingly for cover. A man cannoned into me and fell, leaving the bloody patch on my shoulder. But there was no sound of human voice in all the storm." That very graphic account of the intensity of those defensive fires raises one question. Where was the Australian counter-battery fire? Because it was their role to neutralise those batteries so that they wouldn't be able to interrupt the Australian advance. Lance Corporal Bert Knowles of the 13th Battalion wrote about what it was like in the advance. "It was almost daylight, and although there was still a mist, the drizzle of snow had ceased. Also, our artillery fire, and the enemy machine guns were having it all their own way. Anywhere where men were grouped together trying to penetrate the barbed wire, the machine guns simply wiped out 50% with a swish. But men lay on their sides, hacked at the wire with their bayonets. Some few had cutters, others tried to cross the top, leaping from one strand to another. Many slipped and became hopelessly entangled in the loosely bunched wire. Many were shot down halfway through and hung up on the wire in various attitudes." This equally graphic account raises the same question. What happened to the fire that was meant to neutralise those machine gun positions? Despite the heavy casualties, the men made it through in various parts into OG1, the first German trench, and they started to head to OG2, the second line of defences. In the trench warfare, the Mills bomb came into its own, and when they ran out of Mills bombs, they went in with the bayonet. Soldiers of the 4th Brigade commenced to consolidate their gains and reorganise. Officers, including Harry Murray, who'd already won a VC at this point of the war, pleaded for artillery support. Murray sent a message with a runner at 0:15 to battalion headquarters. He stated that his men were holding the first objective and part of the second, have established a block on the right of both objectives, in touch with the 14th on the left. Expect heavy bomb fighting in evening. There are 6 tanks at a standstill, apparently damaged just beyond the first objective. There are 4 and 2 near the second. Quite impossible to attack the village. A Company 13th badly cut about by machine gun fire in the wire. Some of all other 13th companies here all okay. We will require as many rifle and hand grenades as you can possibly send. Also, small arms ammunition. Most of the Lewis guns are okay. Have 4 Vickers guns. Fear Major Black killed. Several officers killed and wounded. Have plenty men. Have about 30 prisoners from 124 Regiment. We'll send them over at dusk. Look out for SOS signals. With artillery support, we can keep the position till the cows come home." It's worthwhile repeating that phrase. With artillery support, we can keep the position till the cows come home. These aren't the ramblings of a junior officer. Murray is an incredibly experienced soldier. He'd enlisted as a private in 1914, served in Gallipoli. He commanded Alpha Company of the 13th Battalion in an attack on Mouquet Farm. On the night of the 4th-5th of February 1917, he led Alpha Company 13th Battalion in attacking a position on the German Stormy Trench. He led the company as they withstood 3 counterattacks from the Germans. Following the third attack, he led a party of men to push the Germans back to their start line. This was an action that he would see him receive the Victoria Cross for. So he was a highly experienced officer, well placed and with the judgment to make an assessment about how defendable a piece of German trench was. That message was dispatched by runner at 0715. It wasn't until 0900 that they arrived at battalion headquarters. This was sent up the chain to brigade, divisional and corps headquarters, where it was mixed in with the other reports that were coming in so that commanders could attempt to understand what was happening on the battlefield. Tragically, many of the reports were erroneous, reporting significant advances well in advance of where the leading troops were. Bean, in the official history, describes the situation. Both brigadiers, Brand and Robertson, were now fully alive to the true position, that only the Hindenburg line was held and ammunition was needed, but that, as Murray had said, with artillery support we can keep this position until the cows come home. They now endeavoured to have a protective barrage laid 200 yards in front of their troops and on both flanks. The artillery group commander responsible, Lieutenant Colonel Rabbit, however, in the view of the information from artillery observers that tanks and troops were far beyond the Hindenburg line, did not dare give an order, which, if those reports were true, would mean shattering these with his fire. After referring the report back to the observers who confirmed it, he resolutely refused to order the barrage. To the infantry commanders who felt certain that the report was a myth and that the barrage was absolutely vitally needed, the refusal was exasperating in the extreme. A most aggravating telephonic communication took place, notes the diarist of Brand's headquarters, but the artillery staff could not be shaken, and General Birdwood, on the matter being referred to him, supported its refusal. The situational awareness of the brigade commanders was significantly better of that than the corps commander and the army commander. General Gough actually ordered the 4th Cavalry Division to pass through the Hindenburg in the direction of Fontaine. They commenced to act on these orders, with wire cutters moving forward to cut the wire behind the 12th Brigade. These men received significant machine gun fire, and the massed cavalry behind them received the attention of 5.9-inch howitzers, which caused significant confusion amongst the horses, and by 10:30 the force had been withdrawn. The situation in OG1 and OG2 became perilous. Increasing casualties, decreasing ammunition, very few reinforcements were coming either in the shape of men or ammunition, and there was still no artillery support to help fend off the counterattacks. By around 1100, suspecting that it was unlikely to get any artillery support, Murray had changed his appreciation of the situation. David Coombs, in The Battles of Bullecourt, describes the situation. He called together his remaining officers and NCOs and said to them, "Well, men, we are just about out of ammunition and it doesn't look as if anything more can be done. We can either stay here and get skittled or be taken prisoner, or we can get out while our luck is in. What do you say?" Lance Corporal Bamford echoed the men's overwhelming support. "We're with you, Harry, whatever you do." Murray responded, "Well, boys, out we go. Hand over all your ammunition except 10 rounds to the Lewis gunners." Turning to those men, he said, "But chaps, don't be too long after we go." Then again to the others, "There's 2 things now, either capture or go into that." With this, he pointed to the hail of artillery, machine guns and rifle fire raining down in no man's land. Murray, characteristically careless of his own safety, remained in the trench until the last possible moment. Organising the men's withdrawal in small groups of 10, he also bore witness to the carnage as many of them, attempting that dash across no man's land, were cut down by enemy machine gunners and snipers. The German wire, which earlier had been a thorn in the side of the advance, was now an obstacle blocking their withdrawal. The 12th Brigade was in a similar situation. German counterattacks were increasing in intensity and frequency, and there was decreasing ammunition, and they were taking casualties all the while, from machine gun fire, from grenades, and from the artillery. They withdrew back to their own lines as best they could. Brigadier Brand was seen to remark, "To hell with the tanks, I've lost my brigade over them." Captain Tom Chataway wrote, "Through the entrance came a bowed figure, his face twitching with emotion, as if full knowledge of his tragic loss had penetrated his soul. The Brigadier. He passed among us, spoke to us, and gazed at us, a friend seeking friends. The outstanding gallantry of our men became fully known to us. The withering machine gun fire met with, at the barbed wire, the desperate efforts to make a cut through it, the human stares. Of all the battle Australians were in, nothing to equal Bullecourt was ever experienced. Dying men flung themselves across the wire so that their comrades could climb over them. And when at last the lane of death was formed through the wire so as to enable the troops to get to the German line, they captured the position only to sacrifice it again owing to their heavy losses. And as we learnt, this pride took the place of sorrows. The deadly numbness of defeat and the sense of loss was ousted." The casualties to the two brigades were incredibly high. The 4th Brigade, out of a posted strength of 3,000, had suffered 2,339 casualties. The 12th Brigade, out of a posted strength of 2,000, had 950 casualties. Of these casualties, 1,137 of them were taken prisoner of war. Around 4,000 airmen, sailors and soldiers were captured in World War I and became prisoners of war. So at Bullecourt, in this one single action, almost a quarter of the POWs were taken. The Germans were very satisfied with their success. They'd overcome an elite Australian division. They'd vindicated their elastic approach to the defence. We're not going to cover the Second Battle of Bullecourt, but we will briefly mention what occurred after the First Battle of Bullecourt. On the 13th of April, the 4th Division was pulled out of the line and it was replaced by the 2nd Australian Division. It would be almost 12 months before the 4th Division would be back in the line, requiring that long to integrate so many new reinforcements into the division. It would return just in time for the Battle of Amel. On the 15th of April, so the 2nd Division has only been in the line for 2 days, the Germans attack with almost 4 divisions, 23 battalions. The Australian battalions were holding a lot of territory and they were significantly under strength. And the main attack by the 2nd Guards Reserve Division was preceded by no barrage, so the Australians were taken completely by surprise. The Germans were conducting a raid, intent on seizing the Australian gun lines and destroying the guns that had been brought up to support the attack on Bullecourt. Some of the batteries were taken by surprise, only becoming aware that they were under attack as German troops came out of the gloomy morning light. Some were unable to fire in self-defence because they were unaware of the position of friendly troops, many of which were streaming through their positions. Some of the batteries also had very few rifles on position, so they weren't able to defend themselves with small arms. Gunners forced to retreat ensured that the breech blocks and dial sights were taken from the guns so that they couldn't be used against them. As the light of the day improved, other batteries, however, were able to understand the events that were unfolding and bring in withering fire onto the advancing German troops. Some Australian troops surrendered. Some, however, put up dogged resistance, and this broke the momentum of the German assault. Fires were brought down on known troop positions as a prelude to the Australian counterattack. This was commenced by the 19th Battalion, followed by the 9th and 20th Battalions. The Germans suffered 2,313 casualties, whilst the Australians suffered just over 1,000. The Germans had managed to capture 42 guns. By mid-afternoon, 31 of those were back in action. The 4th Battery suffered the worst losses. All of its guns were destroyed. 3 were lost to shellfire, and 3 were destroyed by explosive charges that had been set by the German troops. Not all of the guns that the Germans had captured had been destroyed. This was because they spent more time sacking the lines of the Australian troops for looking for food. The food situation in the German lines not being as good as it was in the Australian lines. In fact, they were quite surprised at the amount of food and the quality of it. There's a couple of lessons to learn from this. Firstly, the need for communication between the infantry and the artillery that they are protecting. Many of the batteries were overrun with very, very little notice. The fact that it occurred at night made it difficult for them to defend themselves because their primary means of defending themselves was direct fire from the guns. Not all members on the gun line had a weapon allocated to them, so it made it very difficult for them to defend themselves. An inquiry was held into the loss of the guns. It was found that it was the troop numbers in the front lines. They didn't have the strength to be able to repel a German surprise attack. There was no real outcome from that, though. It was looked at as the fortunes of war. This was chalked up as a victory for the Australians, given the fact that so few of the guns were destroyed and they'd been able to inflict such heavy losses on the Germans. The 2nd Division, which had replaced the 4th Division, now held the line. They would conduct the Second Battle of Bullecourt. This was fought from between the 3rd and 15th of May 1917. This was launched in support of a continuation of the main British battle at Arras. We don't have time to go into the Second Battle of Bullecourt. Suffice to say, poor staff work on behalf of the Australian Corps saw the lack of neutralisation for the machine guns in Quillon. That once again created significant issues for the attacking Australians. The British were able to seize part of Bullecourt on the 7th of May, and within 10 days all of the ruins lay within their hands. And on the 15th of May, the Australians fought back the last final German counterattack. We'll leave this here and we will come back next week with the lessons from the First Battle of Bullecourt.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.